These days, a lot of the country's political disagreements actually hinge on debates or misunderstandings about the constitutional structure of state and federal government. So what can we do about it?
The goal, instead of trying to funnel power to the right person or your person, is to divide it.
On this episode, we sit down with Utah's new Attorney General, Derek Brown, to hear his vision for the office and how he sees his role defending the rule of law, separation of powers, and restoring America's constitutional order to the core of governance at the state and federal level. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're very pleased to sit down with Utah's new Attorney General, Derek Brown. General Brown, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, Nick.
And also joining us once again is Bill Duncan, who's, of course, our Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow here at Sutherland.
Thanks, Nick. It's nice to see you again.
General Brown, we're really excited to have this conversation because you obviously, you've been recently elected into this position, so it's a new position for you and new position for, or a new person in this role for the state of Utah, and with this new term. And we wanted to kind of take this time to talk with our audience about your role, your vision for the role. We'll get into some details about some of the pending fights or debates that happen.
There's plenty
that you'll be involved with. But first, kind of give us the profile of what you're, a little bit into this new role. What do you see as your vision for what you hope to accomplish in the role of the Attorney General?
Well, one of the ways, probably the most common question I got during the campaign was just, what does the AG do? And it seems crazy that most people wouldn't know that, but the reality is most people don't. I mean, it's you hear a lot of things. People sometimes use phrases like top cop or top lawyer or whatever, but the reality is, the way I think about it, we are the state's law firm. Maybe that's a boring way to put it, but that's really what it is. We are the state's law firm. Our job is to, multifaceted. We have a criminal aspect in terms of we have specific areas where we can prosecute, like we have a division that is internet crimes against children. So we have prosecutors and investigators that work in that area. We also work with the counties on their crimes as well, and we provide backup. I mean, we don't just go in and contrary to what most people think, we don't just go into a county and say, here's what you're going to do. I mean, not long ago, there was a double homicide in Kane County, and they called us up and said, all right, we don't generally get homicides down here. What do we do? And so that's one of the things we do is help out on the criminal side. But then we have in total about 280 attorneys, roughly 600 people total in the office. And our job is to be legal counsel for all the government agencies. There's probably 60 or so different boards, commissions, and agencies. And so for your listeners, anything the government does generally requires some sort of legal advice. So if you're building a road, you need legal counsel. If you are changing the process for a driver's license, you need legal counsel. If you're, addressing something involving Medicaid, you need legal counsel. If you're defending a lawsuit, because the state gets sued all the time, we need good litigators. So most of our lawyers, frankly, aren't in the criminal arena. They do that kind of work. So anyway, it's a very interesting office with a lot of attorneys, and we do almost every type of law you can think of. In fact, I was talking with a group of our attorneys a couple of weeks ago, and I sort of jokingly said, we do everything except patent law. And they laughed, and then one of them said, actually, I've got a patent issue I'm working on right now. So the reality is we do everything imaginable. So it's a big law firm, and it is, with 280 lawyers, it's the biggest law firm in the state of Utah by quite a margin.
So coming to this role, how do you, the question in my mind is, how do you balance sort of, based on that description, you could come in approaching as well, let's just maintain what we're doing. Let's make sure everyone keeps doing the work they're supposed to do and kind of keep the trains running on time, versus is there any other kind of vision or initiatives or things you hope to accomplish? And also part of the context of the question, I'm sure for our listeners and viewers, obviously there have been in past years in the Attorney General's office some issues or controversies. I won't go into the details, but in the context of some of the things that have happened in the past, how do you view kind of what needs to happen now moving forward in the Attorney General's office?
Well, the way I look at it, some of those issues from the past, I think, stem from things that I think can be either addressed or prevented in advance. So, for instance, one of the things that the Attorney General does is oversee all nonprofits for the state. So the Attorney General, in theory, can make a motion to dissolve a nonprofit or investigate one or something like that. And so I've sat on a lot of nonprofit boards in the past. And so what I did in preparation for this role is I resigned from any nonprofit board I was sitting on. The law doesn't require me to do that, but I feel like what I'm trying to do is look for any potential problems in the future and identify those and then eliminate those in advance. So nonprofit boards, I've changed the structure of the office somewhat. I've tried to be really transparent. One of the things that I think there's been some criticism of is people don't know kind of what the Attorney General is doing. Where are you? What are you doing today? I mean, I have this on my calendar. And so one of the things I did, my communications director, Hannah Syriac, who came from the Deseret News, I mean, she understands the press side of this. And so literally on day one, we sent out to the press and then put online a copy of my calendar. Now, I don't technically have to do that under state law, but I just felt like it's a good policy. People should know what you're doing. And if people know what you're doing, then it's easier for them to recognize that you're actually doing what you said you'd do. So one of my visions is just transparency, having people aware of what we're doing, talking with the media. I've spent a lot of time talking with the media just to educate them on what we're doing, answering questions. And so there's a lot of different things going on. But to answer your question, that's one of the areas. And then the other is just to make this a fully functioning, modern 2025 law firm. Because government agencies don't always have the best reputation for being cutting edge. No surprise there. And the state's law firm hasn't always been cutting edge. And so we're looking at things like implementing the use of AI, which is very common now in the legal practice. And as you know, I mean, you've got to look at how you can use that to make you more efficient, more effective. So we're doing some of that, and just doing the kinds of things the law firms would do to be effective. So that's the short answer to a multifaceted approach.
Well, I think that the timeliness is really interesting to me because you're entering office in a time both in the state of Utah and in the country where there is a lot of debate and disagreement around something so fundamental as the rule of law. I mean, for years, we've seen debates about rulings from the U.S. Supreme Court and how laws are interpreted. We've seen debates about, you mentioned the criminal component, debates about just public safety and law and order in cities and how you prosecute or don't prosecute certain things. So it seems to me that and this is an area of work that Bill does tremendous work for us here at Sutherland, is there seems to be a lot of sort of tumult in the world of law and order, criminal justice, public safety, the role of government, period, just separation of powers, states versus federal. Do you feel any of that? Does it feel coming into this that there's a battlefield in the world of law? And if so, how do you navigate it?
Well, I think there is, and we've seen that. I think that in the past couple of years, the left side of the political aisle has advocated for things like defunding police, and I think that's one of the things that backfired pretty tremendously. Is I think people are realizing you need to have government structure, and ironically, for those who look to government as the answer to their solution, to then effectively defund the very government that is the answer to the solution, there's some irony there. But there are a lot of these really critical concepts that we need to not take for granted. I mean, just a month or two ago, I was at a conference where the scholar Jonathan Turley, who you know, he wrote the book Age of Rage, and he's presenting to 1,000 lawyers on the moral basis for the First Amendment free right of expression. And he's basically making the moral case for why being able to express yourself is actually a good thing, and we ought to keep it in place. And if I'm taking notes, and I'm fascinated because I love how he thinks, and I've since read the book Age of Rage, and kind of love his approach. But halfway through, I kind of stopped there and thought, what kind of twilight zone are we in where we have to make a moral case for something that should be as obvious as just free expression of your thoughts, of your opinions? I mean, we've always sort of lived in this society where censorship is generally frowned upon unless there are certain, legal reasons under the First Amendment, clear and present danger and those sort of exceptions. But we now live in a world where that's not to be a given. I mean, places like the UK are dramatically limiting free speech. We've seen actually even Elon Musk had that fight not too long ago with from an X standpoint in the UK, and it's really disturbing what's happening there. And the reality is we are kind of one big, huge Western civilization. So what happens there legally, it affects us. And so the UK, I mean, we can look at them and say, well, they passed, what was it, like the EU passed the CCPA, the Privacy Act. Well, that's the EU. Yeah, except that there's a lot of tech companies right here in Utah that are scrambling and spending money to comply with what happens in the UK. So the rule of law and free expression and some of those concepts that are just, I think, have been so basic for who we are as human beings, and that we've always taken for granted as good things. I hate to say that we have a society now calling them into question, but we do. And so I think we need to be vigilant. And awareness is half of the battle.
Bill, with your scholarship, I mean, focusing on constitutional law and religious freedom here at Sutherland, do you kind of see it the same way? I mean, what is being described is kind of the sense of almost that the constitutional order itself could be at risk because of, like you said, if you have to go out and make the case for why the First Amendment is a good thing, on the one hand, it's like, yes, that's great, we agree with it, but is it concerning that, well, wait a minute, I thought this was a given, like this is in our founding documents. So Bill, from your perspective, is there really sort of this risk of the constitutional structure of the United States not being as wholly adopted by the populace as it used to be? And if so, I mean, how do you think we should correct? I mean, maybe part of it is obviously having elected officials come in who have that perspective. But Bill, what's your take on that?
Well, I agree entirely that there are serious challenges, and it is troubling that I think we did have kind of a shared sense of the Constitution as, obviously there's things we don't understand well about it if we don't read it constantly, but there are issues that were once, I think, widely shared that maybe aren't anymore. This is I think something I always look for in. It's that the attorneys general in the different states can do a great job in bringing attention to these kinds of issues to the U.S. Supreme Court in briefs. Obviously, when a state law is challenged, defending that, even arguing in some cases in front of the court. And so there's a part of me that sees some optimism here, right? As we're kind of questioning all of this, it gives us a chance to make a case that maybe was taken for granted. I mean, there's always that risk that when we assume things are settled, that we don't talk about them, and then the next generation loses them. Now we have to talk about them. So hopefully that will result in better attention and perhaps even more adherence, right, to the principles of the Constitution. So.
Well, let's dive into one of those, because one of the things, and actually, Bill, you've done a lot of work on this lately. One, I guess, kind of the key questions as far as the constitutional system is the proper role of state governments versus federal governments. The term federalism, it's funny. I saw a comment on social media a little while ago. Somebody saying, "Well, no, we don't want more federalism. You're just trying to give more power to the federal government." There's a little bit of just civic literacy there. That, well, no, federalism means states and federal government having appropriate division of power. But I'd love both your thoughts on this. But we'll start with you, General Brown. That seems to be one of the biggest issues facing the United States today, is the imbalance or the mismatch in power and authority and influence between the federal government and the states. That, again, as I've loved having Bill on the show because I get to just learn from him, that it seems like for years or decades it's been trending in the wrong direction. How do you see that balance as it stands now, and what do we need to do to fix it?
Well, one of the things that I've seen and I've sort of been critical of is my colleagues who are in Congress and frankly Utah, we have phenomenal members of Congress. I mean, I and they would agree with me, but the backing of the Constitution was a group of individuals who realized that the goal, instead of trying to funnel power to the right person or your person, is to divide it and to just recognize that humans are inherently self-interested, and then to divide it and then create a system where everyone is given their power with the assumption that you're going to hold on to that power. And if someone encroaches, you're going to push back. And so the system is brilliant that we have not just 435 members of Congress, but then we also have something like 4,000 or 5,000 state legislators. And we have something like 500,000 people in America who are in a city, county, or some sort of position. So it's spread out, and the idea is that everyone retains their power. But what's interesting is I don't think they ever foresaw the idea that Congress would effectively give up their power. And I think that's what's happening when you reference the size of the federal government. Congress through the years has basically stopped doing their job. And so when they legislate to the extent they do, they'll have these really fuzzy phrases like navigable waters, and the EPA gets control over navigable waters. Well, what does that mean? Well, we'd love to define it, but we don't have enough votes to do it, so we're just going to let someone else do our job for us. And so the administrative state, or the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, is just the growth of the administrative part of government, which has caused so many problems. And when the first federal regulations were published in 1936, there were 16 pages. The last year of Biden's administration, there were over 100,000 pages. And those are new regs. These aren't like, and these regulations aren't like, you really ought to consider sending the CFPB this banking information, or we'd recommend, that you help the EPA out over here. It's like you do it, or you're fined. You're fined, or you go to jail, or you lose your job, or you lose your income, or what I'm saying? Like, these are serious things. And so one of the things the attorneys general do is that they collectively represent the states in pushing back. And some people moan and groan about that pushback, but I think that the mentality we should have under our Constitution is that the Constitution limits what the federal government should do, and if it's not there, then everything else should be the states. And it works great that way because we have a state like Utah where we can solve problems pretty quickly. And I've been in the state legislature, I've served there, I've seen problems like be addressed, highlighted, legislation written, passed, and signed into law within 45 days. And I've served for 3 different members of Congress, and I've seen legislation that takes forever to be written, forever to be debated, and in the end goes nowhere. So it's just, that federalism concept of doing it here, it just works better. The system works better, and I just wish that Congress would actually do their job of actually legislating rather than letting unelected bureaucrats do it for him.
One of the things that I think I see, and in some of the work that Bill's done when we've talked about federalism, this issue keeps coming up, is that it seems to be that when we're engaging in whatever big policy debate we're engaged in, public lands has been a big one that we've talked about here in Utah a lot recently, in recent months and years, of course, but really any issue. I think what I keep seeing is there's a tendency for a lot of voters in various states to kind of focus more on, well, whoever gives me the policy outcome I like, or whatever level of government, then that's what I'm going to go with. And it's been the case for years in Utah that people arguing about the public lands issue will articulate that, well, no, we don't want Utah to have more control of public lands because essentially they will do things with those lands that I disapprove of. So if the feds are controlling it, but they're doing something I agree with, I like it. The same thing when it comes to Supreme Court decisions or executive orders or really any big policy debate we can think of. It seems over and over again, people are just jumping to what is the outcome that I like, and then I don't care how we get there. And that seems kind of scary to me, that we're bypassing this question of the proper process and structure that you're articulating of what states are supposed to do, what the federal government is supposed to do, and the branches within the federal government, Congress versus the executive. So I guess my question is, how do we convince people to prioritize the process and the constitutional structure first, and then we can look at policy outcomes? I'm not sure how we do that.
Oh, do we have 5 hours? I mean, can I just say, I think a lot of it's education on what the core principles are. And I've been discussing this with my team because I have on a daily basis, I'll have requests for Utah to join as a litigant or as on an amicus brief or in a letter to an elected official, whatever. There's a lot of these decisions I have to make, and I have to think to myself, what's the core principle here? And so I try to act consistent with the core principles. But the other thing in the back of my mind is the idea that I have to stop and go, okay, what if the folks on the political left were to do the same thing I'm about to do? You know what I'm saying? Like I had a letter they asked me to sign going to a large company, basically telling them what to do when it comes to their DEI policy. And and I'm not a fan of DEI. I think there's some serious issues with that. But then I had to stop and say to myself, okay, as a free market conservative who believes in those principles, I've always been concerned when the left uses the tools and leverage of government to force private sector companies to do what they want. If I'm Attorney General and I'm just doing the same thing, can I really claim the moral high ground? Am I really acting consistent with my principles? And sometimes they're hard decisions, but I think that's the answer is just you got to educate people on what are those principles and ideally have people in public office who have the integrity to say, look, these are the principles and I'm going to follow them, knowing that things may change. I remember when I was, and this has happened many times, that Congress has had the filibuster debate. And it's always great short-term thinking for the party who's in the majority to say, hey, let's get rid of it. Exactly. But when you stop and go, wait a minute, we may be in the majority today, but what about 2 years from now when we're not? Do we really like that outcome? And the answer is probably not. And there's reasons for those principles. And so I think you have to teach them. And I think it's civics. It's civics lessons at school and just generally, what does the country stand for? Why are these guardrails there in the first place? And we want to, people want to just rip them out. But G.K. Chesterton, who's a writer that I really like, used the concept of pulling out fences, right? And his point was, go pull the fences out, but before you do, understand why the fences were there in the first place. And I think our generation now is so interested in pulling out any fence because it stops us from going in to some other place that we need to be aware of that.
If I could maybe jump in a little bit, because I love General Brown's way of talking about that there is a creative tension, right, in our constitutional system where it does mean that occasionally, typically the right things will happen, but there's a risk that they may not, and it may be a little more challenging to get it done in the right way as opposed to just trying to get the right result. And I think that fits well with his vision with your vision, I know you're here, with your vision of the office being transparent about that so that we can see how those decisions are made. And I think that's an element of the education that I think we need, is to see more of that happen where people say, well, yeah, I'd love to say something. I have a lot of feelings about this, but actually that's not my role under the Constitution, and there are things that the federal government is supposed to do, and that's appropriate, and we don't push back there. But when there is a need, I think it's very positive for people to see and to think about, gosh, yeah, I guess I want the result, but if it's not the right way, I'm okay with that because I see others, public leaders especially, who are willing to make personal sacrifices to make sure that happens.
Yeah,
so.
Good point.
Something that comes to mind from that, Bill, is just this idea of, we were talking earlier in the hall of core duties of government. And I want to bring that question to this discussion in terms of, looking at, again, the issue of federalism, states versus federal government, and where federal overreach has occurred. What are maybe some good examples of that? And in particular, what are sort of core duties of government that should be held more so by the states than the federal government? And what are appropriate ways for states to push back? Are there any things you're looking at here in Utah that you can talk about that we are doing or should be doing in the coming years? What can states broadly do? How do we actually, obviously there's the education piece, but also appropriately within the structure of the law, push back where we need to as a state?
Yeah, I think I think we should. By the way, as a side note, you mentioned that concept of doing what's sort of convenient for you, although it may not be consistent with principle. It's interesting to see this from a regulatory standpoint and an executive branch standpoint. There's this whiplash every time a new leader comes in. And so a lot of people who had no problem at all with the previous administration issuing executive orders, upending things, now all of a sudden
Very comfortable.
are going back and saying, well, there should be limits to the executive branch. And they're talking about things like the text of the Constitution, which, I mean, that warms my heart. I love to hear that. So as a state, though, I think one of the things that we should do is, I mean, I think it's our duty to push back. And that's part of the normal checks and balances. And the reality is, I don't know if anyone's job description changed more dramatically than mine on election night, or on the collective attorneys general, because I was planning on this blizzard of lawsuits about, I mean, I've got so many federal regulations that I believe are completely just inane and overreaching. And I mean, we could go through so many of them. I mean, whether you're talking about like the mandate on electric vehicles. I mean, does the EPA really have the authority under the Clean Air Act to do that? I don't believe they do. But those are the kinds of things that we were anticipating. We talk about federal lands. I mean, there's so many areas of overreach. On election night, when President Trump won, all of a sudden what it did was open up the opportunity to have a federal government that agrees with me on the principle that the federal government should be limited. And there's a little bit of irony there, because you have to trust that someone in power will voluntarily relinquish their power rather than grow their power. And that is what a lot of the executive orders are doing, is they're shrinking the power of government, making it, less pervasive. And, I think that's a good thing. And so instead of filing lawsuits, a lot of what I've been doing, frankly, is working with folks that I know who are in the administration to talk about what we can do and to come to a resolution on lawsuits rather than filing lawsuits.
Right. That may be more positive in the long term, though, because I think my sense is that it's kind of an all hands on deck moment where everybody in whatever role they're in can make an enormous difference, right? In returning us to that constitutional framework. And so there will be some ways in which I think you'll still probably have lawsuits, right? That will
absolutely.
have to be filed.
Absolutely.
But it's good to be able to have a little more of a feeling of collaboration. Let's work together to decrease the agency overreach, for instance. And I think that's a strong point in Utah. We did an audit where we looked at all the ways. There's a federalism index. It ranks the different states on how they're doing in terms of supporting the principle of federalism. And the last item, and the one I kind of like the most in some ways, was what does the Attorney General's office do with appropriately pushing back, joining lawsuits when that's appropriate, filing amicus brief when that's appropriate. And I felt great about the way our state has done in the past on this, but looking forward, I think we'll see even more of that. That kind of thing is critical. It's both teaching and acting, I think together, which is important.
Well, and the reality is pushing back against the federal government. I mean, there's two things you can do. I mean, you can legislate as a state, but really it's litigation or working with the administration. And the answer is we're doing both. I mean, we joined a lawsuit. We actually are litigants in a lawsuit against the NRC for the fact that they made it almost impossible for us to regulate and permit nuclear plants. And so, yes, we can work with the administration, but people may wonder, well, are you still going to file lawsuits? Why would you do that? Well, because 4 years from now, we may have a different president. And I'd like to have precedent that reduces the size and the scope of the federal government. So that's one of the things that we do is we litigate and we have communications, and I think that's natural. And the one person authorized to represent the state is the Attorney General. And so that's, as much as I talked earlier about, it's a large law firm, we provide legal advice. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to, is there's one person in every state authorized to sign their name to a legal pleading that says, as a state, we put the full weight of the state behind this particular lawsuit. So it's meaningful, and I think there are differences we can make as a state.
Can I jump in with a question? Do you mind, Nick? One of the other things I think that's so great that the Attorney General's office can do is just defending the people of the state. There are ways in which we have wrongdoers around that affect the people of the state, and your office has a remarkable ability, and I just to put an end to that, or at least to try to put some protections in place. Obviously, the legislature acts to do that, but I've appreciated that the office is defending things like age verification with the material that's inappropriate for youth to see. When you have pharmaceutical companies maybe are taking advantage of what of laws and maybe violating those laws. That's another thing I think the office can do. That people don't really recognize. That's also an important
there's
one.
this legal doctrine called the Latin phrase is parens patriae, which means you can step into the position of the parents in effect and represent the people of the state of Utah on these kinds of suits. So that's what we did with the social media cases. So like TikTok, for instance. We recently have uncovered some really disturbing stuff about what TikTok has done. And we released a redacted version of our complaint. And so you can actually go through and read the TikTok Live app and how they are not just exploiting minors, but profiting from it. And they know exactly what they're doing. So this is where an attorney general comes in and says, on behalf of the people I'm elected to represent and protect, we're going after you. You don't do this. You don't do this to our kids. And there are deceptive trade practices as well that you can get. And that's one of the reasons. There's that. There's the algorithms that are somewhat, somewhat suspicious and cause addictive behavior. And so that's another core function of the attorneys general is to do that. And that's more of a proactive thing on behalf of the people that isn't necessarily federalism, but it's a core objective of the office.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, but I want to ask, either kind of building on those, you mentioned either issues of drugs or social media or those or any other sort of, I guess, battlefields of debate. What do you see in the coming years? If you were to somehow, forecast the next 4 years, what do you see as some of the biggest debates we're going to have as a state, as a country, when it comes to any of these things, separation of powers, the rule of law, things that you see yourself as needing to defend against on behalf of the people of Utah? Give us a prediction, if you will, of where the big fight's going to be.
Well, I think the biggest ones are at the administrative level, because the administrative state has so much power, and I don't even know where to start. You have companies in Utah that are being literally terrorized by the Federal Trade Commission. You have banking institutions that are being terrorized by the CFPB. Everyone who's involved in any activity has a 3-letter agency that can shut them down and put them out of business overnight. We see the same thing, the BLM, for instance, the lands. I think that's one of our biggest issues is how do we push back against each of these agencies. We've seen so many issues with lands. In fact, we're going to see more. We have a Supreme Court case. We were hoping the Supreme Court would take up this issue of the Utah lands. They opted not to, so we're going to be taking a different approach. But the reality is this isn't going away. In fact, I just not long ago talked with a group of 300 people on the East Coast. A lot of them were AGs, and I said, you have to realize, and we may hear this in Utah a lot and get sort of numb to it, but I said, the federal government controls 2/3 of the state of Utah. And I had people afterwards coming up to me going, that can't be right. 2/3 of the entire state is controlled by the federal government? I was, yeah, it's unbelievable. And I said, look, and you have a president who can literally, with the stroke of a pen, declare a monument in Utah the size of the state of Delaware and essentially just plunk it right out of the state and say, okay, you no longer have control over this either. How does that make any sense? Is it right for that to happen? Should there be pushback? And the reality is we have 60 or 70 lawsuits on that issue alone. But I do believe that we're going to see that the next frontier is a president who made it really clear that he wants to pull back on an administrative state in the federal government that can functionally do whatever it wants. And we're going to see there's going to be some growing pains as that contracts. But I think it's a good thing because it reestablishes the idea that everyone sort of assumes the federal government can do whatever it wants unless we can prove that they can't proactively. It's exactly the opposite. And I think it's time to make that clear.
Final comments, Bill. Go to you first, and then General Brown. Have the final word? The 30-second question. Let's say it's fast forward to 4 years from now, just using the parameters of your term to illustrate the question. Bill, if you could identify one thing that would improve in all of the issue areas we're talking about, this kind of umbrella of law and order, public safety, separation of powers, whatever, take your pick. But if there's one thing in 30 seconds or less that would be different a few years from now, what would you say? And then General Brown, I want to hear what you would say as well.
I feel a little guilty because I may steal your thunder on this.
Still away.
We've been writing a lot about agency overreach, and so to get the agencies back in their lane, which is actually a pretty limited lane, would be a dramatic step forward. They really don't have the authority to issue much of what they say they do, and at the very least, getting them to back off from issuing guidance to all of these different private entities and to states themselves. That would be I think so positive, and that the overreach of the federal government I think would almost naturally subside if they had to do things according to the constitutional role. So I think maybe I would say that, but. I apologize if that's what you were going to say.
I love it because, earlier I was criticizing Congress for not doing their job by just letting these agencies do whatever they want. The same can be said for the judiciary. Sure. My biggest concern with the Chevron doctrine, where we just allow the agency's interpretation to be the one we go with, is, again, and Justice Gorsuch has actually criticized the judiciary for this very thing. He said, you're not doing your job either. To just say, well, hey, whatever they said, hey, we're going with that. You're not doing your job. And so I think that the combination of having the Chevron doctrine now a thing of the past and a president who understands what it means to have a federal government that can effectively do whatever it wants and is trying to undo that, those two things are going to come together. And I think we're going to see a major sea shift in what the federal government looks like.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Attorney General Derek Brown, very thankful to you for your time, and we'll, of course, continue these conversations as your term progresses.
Great, thanks.
And Bill, thanks again for being with us.
Thanks for letting me.
Well, we're going to take one quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, everyone. For our key talking points from this episode, I want to focus on what Bill and the Attorney General, Derek Brown, both said right at the end of the discussion when I asked about the one thing that they want to see improve in the next 4 years in the context of all the issues that we've been talking about on this episode. And what they said was, one, that federal government agencies would only act within the proper legal authority they have, and two, that the judiciary won't simply defer to federal agencies anymore, in large part thanks to Chevron deference no longer being the practice. I want to add a layer to that we will have the right balance between federal and state power. I've said before that I think more federalism will lead to better policy outcomes overall, and it'll make a big difference in reducing the polarization, the stress, and the contempt that so many Americans feel with respect to national elections. The United States of America is a big and diverse country. The best way to manage so many people with different perspectives is the structure laid out in our Constitution, which requires states and the federal government to stay in their appropriate lanes of governance. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. And don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who you think might find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, and if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.